If you are completely new to the franchise, then Castlevania is a series of horror-themed action platformer games developed and published by Konami. The story of the series centers around the intergenerational war between the Belmont clan of vampire hunters and the king of vampires himself, Count Dracula. Castlevania evolved from the games Konami had released on the MSX home computer in the 1980s. King's Valley, a Konami game from 1985, featured a tomb-raiding adventurer killing skeletons and collecting treasure, and 1986's Nightmare Demon Castle Legend is about a courageous hero assaulting an evil castle filled with ghosts and monsters. Once introduced, Castlevania quickly became Konami's top-selling franchise. The original NES trilogy sold millions of units. The first Game Boy game sold 2.5 million units just by itself, and in that respect it remains the most successful Castlevania game ever. The games went from strength to strength into the 16-bit era, but sales started to wane. The last two games released during the 16-bit era are actually the worst-selling games in the entire Castlevania franchise. And so heading into the 32-bit console generation, Castlevania really needed a shot in the arm if it was going to compete in an increasingly competitive market. Superficially, the two Castlevania games released on the PlayStation do look pretty similar, but as a duology they demonstrate really nicely Konami's path to the metroidvania franchise and also represent a real turning point for the series. By showing where the franchise began and where it ended up, they perfectly showcase what I'm calling the two trouser legs of Castlevania. As I had previously mentioned, the original Castlevania was inspired by the linear action platforming and horror elements of games like King's Valley, Goonies, and Nightmare on the MSX. For Castlevania 2, the series producer Hitoshi Akamatsu revisited those franchises to look for some new ideas. Both King's Valley and Nightmare had received sequels on the MSX after Castlevania's release. Akamatsu even said that Nightmare 2, The Maze of Gallius, directly inspired what he tried to do with Simon's Quest. Around this time, two realities were formed. Down one leg, you've got that classic Castlevania, the action platformer. It's linear, it has a focus on action. But down the second leg comes this non-linearity with a bigger focus on exploration. Now Castlevania really just ended up going down that first leg, and this ultimately concluded with the Japanese exclusive Rondo of Blood on the PC Engine, while that second leg was pretty much left abandoned. Rondo is in fact the perfect example of the 2D action platformer in my opinion. It's basically as far down that first leg as you could possibly get. Konami were actually getting concerned with how much longevity this gameplay style had left in it. The 32-bit era was less concerned with these shorter arcade-style games with brutal difficulty curves. So when Konami were looking to bring Castlevania to the PlayStation, trying to top Rondo of Blood looked like a fool's errand. In a largely unprecedented move by Konami, the core team from Rondo of Blood were tasked with making a direct sequel to their own game. Only this time, their sequel was going to revisit the gameplay style of Simon's Quest. The credits for these games are getting way too long now for me to mention every team member, so all I can do really is just mention the key members. The team was headed up by Toru Hagihara. Hagihara had programmed Castlevania 2 on the Game Boy and had been the director and programmer of Rondo of Blood. Reika Bando, who had done some excellent pixel art on Rondo of Blood, was also back on the art and design, bringing their impeccable pixel art skills, but now with a whole team of artists. Michiru Yamane was brought in to do the music, having previously worked on Castlevania The New Generation, and a young Konami programmer called Koji Igarashi, who had been dating a member of the Rondo of Blood team, asked to be transferred to Symphony of the Night as a programmer. I'll talk about each one of these people a little bit more later in the video, but I do want to take this opportunity to talk about the artwork of Ayami Kojima. The Castlevania series up until this point had used all kinds of artists and painters and had never really aimed to have any kind of coherent vision. But Kojima's high gothic illustration style and her mixed media paintings, it moved Castlevania out of this just generic European dark fantasy, and it gave it its own immediately recognizable, unified aesthetic. The Symphony of the Night is actually the first professional outing for Ayami Kojima, and that's incredible. Castlevania is filled with women absolutely smashing it out of the park on their first attempt, and Kojima is no exception to this rule. She is amazing. In terms of the story, Symphony of the Night opens up with the final act of Rondo of Blood. Richter Belmont of Clan Belmont, forever sworn enemies of Count Dracula, defeats the Vampire Lord and puts him back into his slumber, to be defeated again 100 years in the future by one of Richter's descendants. This is your standard Castlevania stuff, nothing really new here. The game then jumps 5 years into the future. Richter has disappeared. Dracula's castle has risen 95 years early, and with no Belmonts to defeat him, it's up to Dracula's son, Alucard, to figure out what's going on. Alucard was originally a side character in Castlevania 3 on the NES. Symphony of the Night was allegedly originally intended to be a spin-off. Using a side character for the protag wasn't considered to be that big of a deal, and the idea was that this would allow Hagihara's team the freedom to do whatever they wanted. And boy, did they. It wouldn't be unfair to say that before Symphony of the Night, Castlevania games were deliberately and sometimes relentlessly difficult. You had to go to the right, and if you reached a part where you couldn't go right anymore, well, then you were done. But by taking direct inspiration from contemporary non-linear games like The Legend of Zelda, Symphony of the Night emancipated itself from being just another brutal attrition contest. Instead, you've got this massive castle to explore in any way you see fit. You don't have access to the entire castle from the beginning, of course. You'll be exploring down paths until you reach a dead end, certain that you'll be able to come back later and progress further once you've got some new ability. Then when you unlock this new ability, you'll go, ah yeah, I remember now, I can go back there. It's not Mensa level stuff, but it does reward your exploration with that little drip, drip, drip of dopamine. The map is enormous, and there is absolutely no signposting, so in that respect it is very much like Simon's Quest. There is no direct path, there's no dotted white line, but there's also very little getting lost. You're free to explore everything at your leisure, so each new discovery feels like you've earned it. And with the castle being this big, non-linear super dungeon, the boss encounters aren't just something you do at the end of a level, they're actual denizens of the castle. They're hanging about until you chance upon them. If you weren't poking about, you could probably complete the game and see less than half of them. And the fights themselves are often the biggest reward. That's reward enough, because some of them are just amazing to look at. I mean, just look at some of these. This is so sick. Depending on how well you've explored the castle, you might find some items which make these bosses absolutely laughable, and you can often find a way to cheese them. But do you know what? If you can, then do, because in Castle Dracula, a win is a win. Just take it. Much like in Simon's Quest, if you do reach a difficult boss, or if you stumble into a new section and you're getting bashed about, you're under zero obligation to stay and slog it out. You can bugger off elsewhere and level up for a bit, find new upgrades, more health, and then come back when you're ready. There are save rooms everywhere, so you don't really lose that much progress if you do get bopped. When you think about this being a sequel to Rondo of Blood, which is an absolutely nails game, it's kind of wild how easy Symphony of the Night feels by comparison. For the first third of the game, you do feel like you're up against it, but once you hit a certain point, you've got good armor and a lot of HP and you're killing most of the enemies in one hit, the game becomes far more laid back and you're just chipping around looking for secrets. And I have no doubt that this is why Symphony of the Night is the most highly rated Castlevania game. Symphony of the Night does keep enough of those core Castlevania tenets alive to keep it feeling like an authentic Castlevania game. There's no whip, but you do kill a lot of skeletons. You still smash candlesticks for money and hearts. There's still meat hidden in the walls. Incidentally, my brother was over for Christmas and was watching me play this game, and he was asking me things like, why is there money in the candlesticks? And why don't the hearts increase your life? And I was like, because this is a sequel to the game from the 80s when nothing made sense. Stop asking questions, mate. In case you happen to be like my brother and don't have a lot of exposure to the Castlevania series, hearts are ammo for Alucard's sub-weapons. You see, he can carry normal weapons, which you can use by pushing the attack button, but right from the very first game, Castlevania gave the player these special sub-weapons, which you can use by holding up and pressing the attack button. Now these include things like a throwing knife, an axe, and a bottle of holy water which you throw like a hand grenade. New sub-weapons which were added in Symphony of the Night are things like a bouncing diamond, a gun that shoots lightning, and salt? The biggest difference in Symphony of the Night compared to other Castlevania games is the amount of stuff. Dracula's castle is littered with all kinds of new weapons, armor pieces, hats, all kinds of gear. The game also introduces consumable items like potions and food. You end up doing this a lot. And then of course we've got the relics. Every Castlevania game from the very beginning has mentioned Dracula's ability to morph into a wolf or a bat or mist, but we never see him do it. But you can actually do it in this game as Alucard. And then of course we've then got familiars, and then there's spells. Some of the weapons have got special moves. There's D&D style stats which are increased or decreased depending on what you're wearing. It's nearly too much. And that's before we even talk about there is a trail of breadcrumbs which unravels the story and will then unveil Symphony of the Night's true ending. You will only find this if you hunt down every square corner of the map and read all of the item descriptions. So it isn't entirely opaque, but you will miss it if you don't push for that 100% completion. But by devoting yourself to exploring the castle, your reward is a pretty sick twist. You see, Richter has been possessed by Shaft, the evil priest that he killed in the previous game. Shaft has driven Richter mad and convinced him that if he resurrects Dracula, he can keep defeating him again and again. By defeating Shaft's ghost and releasing Richter from his spell, a second secret castle is revealed, identical to the first, but flipped entirely on its head. The ramifications of this are immense. A whole other castle filled with new items, new enemies, new bosses, and a true ending, which technically you could miss if you didn't look for it, is a wild gamble to take. And this means that every room in the entire game has actually been designed to work either way up. That's double the work and double the risk. That is absolutely f***ing exceptional. Anyway, once you've completed the game, you can start again and then play the entire game through as Richter. At this point, I just have to stop talking about all the stuff because this game just keeps on giving. And that's probably the biggest takeaway I have from Symphony of the Night. The absolute excess that Konami managed to cram onto one CD-ROM is crazy. Partway through developing this game, Toru Hagihara got promoted to bigger things in Konami, and so programmer Koji Igarashi was stepped up to assistant director to finish the game. By all accounts, it was Iga's vision to go absolutely nuts cramming in all this stuff, to deliver a game which had a longer playtime and better value than, say, an action game that can be blasted through in an hour. I think it's important to make the distinction here that Symphony of the Night chose not to jump to 3D, as so many other franchises were doing. Konami took these Castlevania veterans and used their skills and experience to the fullest. More animation frames, multi-sprite bosses, particle effects. They took what was good about those 2D games and pushed every concept to its logical conclusion, and also just increased the scale of everything. One of my favourite parts of Castlevania is the music. Composer Michiru Yamane was given pretty much free rein to do whatever she wanted on this soundtrack. Inspired by the game's visuals and riffing off of Ayami Kojima's artwork, Yamane's soundtrack is baroque, it's jazzy, and it's metal AF all at once. If I'm being completely honest, then Symphony of the Night isn't my personal favourite Castlevania soundtrack, but I could definitely understand if it was yours. There are some key tracks here that I do love. The Colosseum is a chill guitar jam. The end credits have a surprise track which is written by Rika Muranaka and it's sung by Cynthia Harrell. If you recognise those names, then you may well recognise them from the music of Michiru Yamane, the art of Ayami Kojima, and the vision of Koji Igarashi would define the sound, the look, and the play of Castlevania for years to come. And it's all down to this one game. Symphony of the Night was a huge turning point for the series. Ironically, by trying something wildly different, Symphony of the Night ended up redefining what Castlevania would be about. There is a certain amount of irony here, with Konami looking to shake up the formula so much for Rondo of Blood's sequel that they actually ended up completely switching genres. And to remind us, they released Castlevania Chronicles. Produced by Igarashi, Castlevania Chronicles came out in May 2001 in Japan and November 2001 in Europe. To put that into context, that is nearly a full year after the launch of the PlayStation 2. Chronicles is a PS1 port of the X68000 remake of the original Castlevania, which in a roundabout way is to say that it is a remixed version of Castlevania 1 and it plays just like the original. So it's slow, has fixed jump distances, is hard as f***. The disc comes with two versions of the game. Both are the exact same story of Simon Belmont on his journey to kill Dracula in 1691, 100 years before Rondo of Blood. One of these is a straight up port of the X68000 game. The second is called Arrange Mode. Arrange Mode adds a much needed difficulty setting, but the rest of the differences are largely cosmetic. Ayami Kojima was continuing creating series artwork, so the sprites for Simon Belmont and for Dracula have been redrawn so that they match her artwork. And I love this red-headed Simon. This should have become canon. No longer shackled by the constraints of an 8-bit computer, Chronicles' sound and music was completely re-recorded for CD audio. The remixed tracks by Sota Fujimori and Hiroshi Izuka are 2000s AF. We've got everything from Eurobeat to Y2K edge rock. In an interview, Koji Igarashi said that his reasoning for releasing Castlevania Chronicles was not only because it was previously only released in Japan, but also because it was only released on an obscure old computer, and he thought that more people should play it. It received mixed reviews on release, and fair enough, it's good fan service, but a port of an 8-year-old PC game released on an outdated console the same year that Halo and Metal Gear Solid 2 came out, that's a big ask. No doubt this decision was influenced by the fact that the two N64 Castlevania games had whimpered somewhat at retail, but in retrospect, I think this was a masterstroke. By showcasing where Castlevania came from, you're all the better to appreciate where Symphony of the Night ended up. Castlevania Chronicles was released onto PSN in 2008, but I don't think it's received a modern re-release yet. As a very handsome YouTuber put it last year, this could have positioned itself as being the definitive edition of Castlevania, but a lot of the cool stuff introduced in Super, like stair grabs and diagonal whipping, didn't make it into this, and that is a shame. But as is, it's probably the best remake of Castlevania 1 out there, so give it a go if you're curious. At a time when 3D graphics were dominating the market, Konami took a huge gamble with Symphony of the Night. More so when you realise that shaking up the formula this much could well have alienated the existing Castlevania fanbase. Despite selling well in Japan, Konami's confidence may have been a little bit shaken. because when the game came to market in the US and Europe, Konami only ponied up for a really short run of discs. It actually sold pretty well in the US, eventually getting a greatest hits release, but in Europe, the game did not go over well. Reported sales were as low as 15,000 units, with many of these being discounted at retail. The fact is, Metal Gear Solid sold 7 million units in 1998. Symphony of the Night has sold 1.2 million units to date. Newer franchises like Dance Dance Revolution and Winning Eleven were where Konami was going because those were making money. Some say that Symphony of the Night was Castlevania's swan song, that the series never really reached this height again. I don't think that's true, as arguably the best games in the series were still to come. But the fact remains that Castlevania Symphony of the Night is the most significant Castlevania game in the franchise. For better or for worse, Symphony of the Night defined what Castlevania means to most people. Yamane's music, Kojima's art, Iga's philosophy, it defined not just future Castlevania games, but it inspired other games, and it kind of cemented that whole exploration platformer subgenre. Symphony of the Night is on everything with a screen. It still gets cited as one of the greatest games, it still gets props. We can still see and feel the effects of this game today, not just in other games, but so much cool stuff from this game ended up as part of the Netflix animated series, and for a 20-year-old PlayStation game, I think that's pretty rad. As a duology, the two Castlevania games released for the PlayStation work really well together. The genesis of the 2D action platformer married to its natural next step in evolution. Where we were, where we are. And I just think that's neat. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this latest episode in my series retrospective of all the Castlevania games. If you enjoyed this and want to see more, then click any of these links which I've got up on screen, and by all means subscribe because there's more coming out in the next year. If you'd like to support the channel in any way, you can become a channel member in the link below the video, and you can buy channel merchandise, which is all linked in the video description. If you want to hang out, then you can follow me on Twitter, or you can join my Discord server. Again, link in the description. Thanks so much. I'm going to end this one here, and I'll see you all in the next video. Alright then. Ta-da.